He's an educator, researcher, evaluator, and game designer with the Museum of Life and Science. Please welcome to the stage, Max Cawley.
Hey, thanks, Wade. I was just desperate to not go after all of my very talented friends and colleagues. But there is one really good thing about going last, and there's no time limits. Wrong way.
We're going to discover if that's true.
We are going to find out if that's true, yes. My name is Max Cawley. I design games for science learning at the Museum of Life and Science in Durham, North Carolina. I'm here this evening to talk, like many of my colleagues, about why games are a really excellent use of your time. All of my colleagues so far have talked about why this is true. I'm here to talk specifically about why games are such powerful and important learning tools. Games, according to professor at Arizona State University, James Paul G., are their own semiotic domain. They're a type of literacy. And I think this is a really powerful way of looking at and thinking about games that, like other types of literacy, mathematics or reading or writing, they have its own set of rules that you have to work at, that you have to practice, that you have to work towards mastery. Games are their own semiotic domain, just like those. And because of that, games are always these novel, new, and interesting environments that are really powerful learning tools. So unfortunately, when we think about games as learning tools, we sometimes can go about it kind of backwards. And we think about learning through games as needing to cram in a bunch of things for people to memorize. In my case, lots of science games designed for curricular learning, unfortunately, start from the place of what words do students need to memorize to come out of this. We call this model chocolate-covered broccoli, because you should really start making a game by thinking about what your learner or what your gamer is actually going to do with their time during the game. And if you start instead with thinking about what learning is going to come out of it, your learner or your gamer is going to understand that you didn't start from a game. They're going to know that you're serving them chocolate-covered broccoli. And this model does not really fall in line with what we know about game design. It also doesn't really fall in line with what we know about how we learn. This is Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, because all of you here elected to come to some fun evening about gaming and not a graduate level course. We're not going to go over this. Instead, my way of conceptualizing, of thinking about learning, is as a struggle. From, again, Vygotsky's 5 pillars of learning, learning is a lifelong struggle to make sense of the world. And luckily for us game designers, games can really be boiled down to, they can be defined as basically struggle commodified, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that struggle here in a second. But because games are this really ripe, new opportunity to have this small little struggle for yourself, they are always, always, always valuable opportunities for learning. And the cool thing is, this is true whether you're playing a game that we understand and know and conceive of being something cool and valuable, a space we already associate with learning, like chess. It's also true for first-person shooters. It's also true for games like Mario Kart. There is learning inherent in those games as well. So when we start thinking about gamifying something like, let's say, science curriculum, again, I am at a science museum, there are all of these different game-like concepts that you can apply to start creating games out of these science concepts. One of them we're very familiar with is competition. Another one is role-playing. Another one is scarcity. Another really good one is strategy. We're going to come back to that one. There's one really, really important game-like piece that we sometimes forget to put in. And this really vital one, I would posit, is more important than all of the rest of these. And that one is play. Thank you. I would also say that if you are making a game that includes all of these other game-like concepts, but you are not including play as one of those game-like concepts, we actually have a word for what we might call that game, and that word is a task. And you might think to yourself when you're designing a game, am I making a game or am I making a task? Again, apropos of nothing, if you're making a game without play, you are probably making chocolate-covered broccoli. Now, when we think about how people learn in informal spaces, like museums, learning again boils down to those intellectual and emotional connections. And sometimes, in very short touch points that you have with learners, you might only have time to create this powerful emotional connection to science content. And one of the most powerful emotional tools that we have in a game is frustration. My favorite game designer, Bennett Foddy, who created games like Q-Op or Getting Over It, codified these 11 different flavors of frustration that I find really excellent to think about. I've picked 3 of them, but I highly suggest that you go and look at all 11. One of my favorites of his is Nearly There, but Not Quite. Another one is I Don't Know Where to Start. Another one is I've been here before, and sometimes this is that you have to start all over again, or as in the case with this game, when you get to the next level, you actually start the whole game all over again. Bennett, if you are watching, by the way, I've come up with 3 of my own based around board games, which is mostly what I create. Here's one of them. Someone else had a good idea on their turn. This one's really frustrating to me. I thought it was strategy, but turns out it's just chance. This one needs no explanation. Frustration is a really, really powerful emotional tool that you have in your games that leaves a really powerful impression. Now, a lot of federal agencies, when they fund stuff for learning for the general public, what we often call these broader impacts, rely on novel communication strategies that, again, may not be reading or writing or traditional ways that we think about literacy. Games are also a communication tool. They are a great way to connect people with sometimes complex science learning. In one case, a game that I designed called Hot Lane, we took on a piece of complex science learning that was about this phenomenon right here, which is everybody's favorite experience, universally hated standing in lines. It turns out that over the course of your lifetime, you likely spend between 1 to 2 years standing in line. Really cool. Now close your eyes. You don't have to close your eyes. But again, picture that emotional connection that you have to this complex science, right? How do you feel right now just thinking about standing in line? Some of the research that goes into this actually suggests that standing in line and your emotional reaction to it actually doesn't really have very much to do with how long you spend in line. It has a lot more to do with some other factors, including how bored you are in line, but also including the other competitors that are around you. Lines, it turns out, are already sort of game-like. You are already kind of in competition around other people. So our game, Hot Lane, again, tried to go out and recreate some of this emotional experience of standing in line so that we could think about what kinds of line designs people got the least frustrated with versus the most frustrated with. It turns out, again, that when you are standing in line, it is not necessarily efficiency that matters the most to you about that line that you are in. It is fairness. It is the slight of other people around you, maybe getting one over on you by getting into line a minute or two behind you, but then, geez, you look over and they're already being served for some reason. There is absolutely nothing more frustrating than that experience. And there is actual excellent ways to mitigate some of this stuff. Now, I'm probably just about out of time. I can see somebody about to ring the bell. So we call it strategy when you're good at it, right? One good question, and this is a win-win because I think you get a dog bandana if you ask this question, but you could ask, tell me more about Hot Lane. Tell me more about this game. Okay, thanks.
All right, who's got questions about broccoli? All right, we got one coming right over here.
I think it's great what you're doing, but how do you make these accessible to visitors with disabilities, students with disabilities?
Really excellent question. Yeah, fantastic question. A lot of the games that we are creating are designed to be played within classroom spaces or within informal science spaces. So some of them include interpretive tools that are outside of necessarily needing to read things. Some of them also include interpretive materials for folks that are visually impaired or that are unable to hear. This is a really excellent question that I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on, but I'd be really happy to talk with you more about it after today. Thanks.
All right, other questions? Got one right here. I'm going to scooch around this side.
How do you add learning to non-educational games?
I'm sorry, could you say that one more time?
The question is, how do you add learning to non-educational games?
Oh, what a good question. I would posit that every time you play any game, you are learning. You are working towards mastery within that space, right? So even in a game where you are not perceiving of yourself as learning, most of the learning that you do within your lifespan, about 95% of it, happens outside of these formal environments. So every time that you step within that magic circle of a game, you are giving yourself this really wonderful opportunity to become literate at whatever it is that game is trying to teach you. And in many, many, many cases, there are already learning opportunities built into just about every game. And I'll perhaps some of my other colleagues that were up before me can back me up on some of that too.
All right, next question coming front and center here.
Tell me more about Hotlink.
Oh, excellent question. Wow. That's so weird. I wonder how somebody knew to ask that question. Hotlane essentially put you against very directly the other people who are standing in line around you. Time in this game was your commodity, but you could spend more money to move yourself into a gold or silver line where there will perhaps be fewer people in front of you, or perhaps the line for some reason would move more quickly. But there's always going to be these other things that happen in line around you. Maybe the receptionist gets a phone call, or maybe they drop a pen, or there's all sorts of reasons why you would have to miss your turn. So really the way that Hotlane ends up is that, and this is true also, it turns out, for standing in line, the more that you switch lines, as is the case in this middle one here, the more time you actually spend to stay in line over the course of your lifetime. So there is really excellent design when it comes to this model that we have here, as they use in most grocery stores, versus the serpentine line that they use in a lot of stores, fast food restaurants now. Because this one over here tends to at least be fair, which it turns out is one of the most important things in line. And some line designers, some people who do a lot of science behind queuing, have really figured out that one of the most key things you can do is actually just take the focus off of all of your competitors, off of all the other people in line, by giving them something else to do. So there are places where you might stand in line for hours and hours and hours at a time, but if you're occupied, if you're not looking at, if you're not thinking about your competitors around you, the people who are in line around you, you're less likely to look at yourself as being in competition with them. So if you're designing a queue, give them something to do, and perhaps think about doing the serpentine way of moving through the line instead.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, give it up for Max Cawley.